game that I built just to demonstrate the main elements. So what you could see here is a plain field covered with grass. There are some objects, so I'll show you the gameplay first just to demonstrate some mechanics. So let's do the preview of the game. I'll click on the preview button. So the first thing that we need to do is we're gonna run to the door and we'll try to open the door. And you notice that the door, when I press the E button, it does not open up because we don't have the key. If I look at the console, it says player does not have proper key. So let's find the key. So our objective is to find the key. So right now the key is hidden inside of this boulder, and once we touch the boulder, now we see the key. Now we can pick up the key. Now we have the key. Let's go back to the door. We can open the door. There's an area. We can either open the door by pressing the button or just by approaching the door. There's a trigger. So here's the door, and it's gonna close within 4 seconds. Now here are the two buttons, the plus button and the minus button. So now we are within the server area. So this is a server. Now if we point to the plus button and we interact with it pressing E, that creates a new pod. We can create multiple pods. So you notice we have space on this server. We have space for 5 pods. So I'm gonna keep pressing the button. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have total of 5 pods, and they're all connected with the network. Now these pods are empty. We can create containers by pressing on the green bar. So here's a container, and we can keep pressing the E button to create multiple containers, up to, I think I configured 30 containers total. So we can add these containers. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. This one has 30 containers. Or we can destroy these containers by pressing the red button. 1, 2. So we only have one container. So one. We can add a bunch of these containers here. Or we can destroy them. Okay. Now we can also destroy entire pods. So for example, you could see this last one. If we go here, and the last one, the pod with, so let's add more containers on this pod. So we have a whole bunch of these containers. Now if I go here and I interact with this minus sign for the pod, this whole last thing has disappeared. Now this one disappeared. Now we have only these things. That's it. So that basically shows you the server area. We can, next step for me will be to make this car fly. It's relatively easy. You can add engines. There are different actions that can be done. We can interact with all kinds of different objects. So far, this is just a demonstration how to interact with keys and do different things. Now if we exit the game and go into the edit mode, so you can see how the key interaction works, for example. So you can see there's a cluster locator. So here's a cluster locator. Now under cluster locator we have cluster wall, we have the adding pod, removal pod. So let's look at the pod, add pod. So if we look here, so here's the add pod. So I can move this around back and forth. I can also look at the script for the add pod. Um, um, Let me see. If we go into scripts, we'll look at the pod manager script. So the pod manager script, basically, it says on interact. Yeah. So the add pod, that button, whenever the player interacts with the button, then what it will do, it will invoke cluster locator object. So entity is cluster locator, that's the entity. Script is cluster management, which is this script. And then the event will be add pod. So basically the event add pod, it says if number of pods does not, um, if it exceeds the maximum pods, we just exit. If it doesn't exceed, we just increment the number of pods. Then we clone the template pod because we have this pod that is always there. I call it the where's my template pod locator. So here's the template container template. If we look at the game, in the game it's not visible. Here's the container template. This is where all of these things are configured, but I just don't show it initially. So if I click it, make it visible, this is the one that's being used as a template. But it is invisible and it's not collidable as well. So collision enabled is false. But in the script, I copy this entire pod locator and I make it active, which means I make it visible. I also make it collidable as well. And then I go and say pod manager show objects, and here's a script that is a pod manager show objects. What it does, it basically makes the little fence visible. It's a pod barrier, so you could see by default it's invisible. If I go into the game and I click on this, here's the fence. So in this script, in the pod manager, I make it's visible, collidable. I also add the trigger. The trigger is this little add container trigger. If I make it visible, you could see it here. Remove container. If I make it visible, it's here. So here they become visible objects. So that's how we add these pods, and within the pod the same principle applies. Whenever we add objects or remove objects, we clone those objects and then we make them visible and collidable. So that's pretty easy. As far as the key script, when we have player colliding with the key script, we add the player to the internal table. So here is a table that's players with the key. Once the collision happens, we add the player to that table. We activate the sound, and we make the key invisible, and then we remove collision on the key. And that's how the key disappears. So this part, once the player is added to the list of players with the key, once we look at the door script, server door script, then whenever we have interaction with the user, whenever the player interacts with it, we basically check if the key has the player in that list. And then the key here is listed in the properties. So here's the key as an entity. So if we look at the door cluster wall, and then we have the server door, one of the properties here is the key that opens the door. The other properties are open sound, close sound, and fail sound. So that's at the high level how this works. I hope you can take it and make something interesting out of this. We can also make objects float or fly and do all kinds of other things. This is really just a prototype to as a proof of concept.